have been a member of the Villanova community since 1996. I came as a young graduate student who was finishing my PhD. I was down at the University of Pennsylvania, and the English department was looking for someone that taught 19th and 20th century African American literature. And I have spent my years teaching African American literature. I specialize in works like those of Toni Morrison and playwright August Wilson and the Harlem Renaissance. I teach 19th century African American literature focusing on slavery and on Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction literature. And I actually, this semester, I'm teaching a course on African American drama and the work of resistance. And I'm thinking about questions of resistance. How do people resist injustice and oppression? And I think that is a multi-layered answer, right? That's not just one thing. So I've spent my years teaching, and then shortly after I received tenure, I became the director of the African American Studies program here, Africana Studies program at Villanova. I held that position for either 10 or 11 years. And then 5 years ago, I became the Associate Dean of Baccalaureate Studies for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I love that role. I think that Villanova is poised in a very particular way to prepare its students, and I think also to support its faculty and to support its staff into creating the kind of community that we want to see in the wider world. I think that we are uniquely poised to prepare our students to be both empathetic and prepared academically, but also to become change agents. And one of the things that I have thought about throughout my career is the ways that I stay here on Villanova's campus, but my students go out into the wider world. They go out into the world to do a variety of things. Some become teachers, some become policymakers, some become physicians, some become lawyers, some become filmmakers, right? They do all kinds of work. And I know that about them. I know that when I meet my students, many of them, they don't even know what they're going to do yet. And many, when I meet them, they have known since they were little children what they were going to do. But what they all have in common is that they, one, are going to leave Villanova with a very influential degree. And because of that, I have always thought it was really important to prepare my students to become people who can make change, and people who will not meet other people who are different from themselves and treat them like stereotypes. That's always been very important to me. And I've always thought that Villanova, because of Villanova's mission, because of Villanova's guiding principles of unity and truth and love, that because we are guided by that mission of unitas and caritas and veritas, that we then have the ability to sort of overtly and forthrightly prepare our students to go off and to do good in the world. I think that knowing your identity is extremely important, no matter who you are. And I think that we have begun to talk about identity and the importance of identity relative to Black people. We have talked about that, particularly like in a moment like this, during Black History Month of 2022, even being a part of this project of 28 Days and beyond, that it is important for African Americans, for folks who have become from the African diaspora, to know who we are. But I actually think that identity is important for everyone, right? When we know who we are, where we've come from, who our people are, who we have descended from, I have always thought that that was important no matter who you were. If you were Italian, if you were Jewish, if you were of Euro descent, right? If you were of Asian descent, no matter who you are, because what it does is it makes me think about the old Verizon commercial that you had this network behind you, right? And wherever you went, you had the Verizon network behind you. Well, in my mind, that's got to be important for everyone, right? To know that you come from something, that you didn't just hatch out of an egg, that you've come from generations of people. One of the things that has been resonating in my mind lately, and I don't know why this is, I don't know if it's as I'm creeping towards 60, I don't know what it is, but one of the lines from Maya Angelou's poem just rings in my head, that I am the hope of the slave. And I think about that all the time. I am who my ancestors prayed I would be, right? That I am a Black woman who is at an historically white institution, right? Where I was the first person of color to be tenured in my department. I am the first Black woman to hold an associate dean's position in the College of Arts and Sciences. I take those things very seriously, but I also think about them in terms of my identity as the descendants of slaves. So when I think of 2020, I think of a lot of things. I think of exhaustion. I think of isolation. I think of innovation. I think of the ways that all of us were forced in some way to pivot on a dime. We have overused that word pivot, but it's what we all did, right? We literally, I think about like basketball moves, we literally were turning on a dime. We had to change our modes of instruction. We had to change our modes of learning. We had to change many of our modes of interacting with each other. We couldn't be together. We couldn't, I'm a person that loves to go out to dinner. I couldn't, all the restaurants shut down, all kinds of things. I couldn't meet my friends for lunch. I couldn't go out with my husband for dinner or with my son for dinner. I couldn't just go in and out and see my mom and my dad, all of that. For a while, church was shut down and we had to go online. All of those kinds of things are what I think of for 2020. But I will also say that I also did a lot of thinking during 2020, and I did a lot of writing. And I did a lot of soul searching and reevaluating. And for me, 2020 also became a time to think about and rethink about what was important and what wasn't important. It made me start to think about how quickly we were able to shed certain things and then to not do them anymore. And that made me think a lot about what's important in my life. For my students, I was very, very careful and very attentive to my students, to their needs. I knew that my students were affected in ways that often they couldn't even articulate. I was teaching that semester, and one of the things that I was very careful to do, I met with each of my students periodically, individually, because I found that what would happen is I would ask them, so how's everybody doing, right? Like we would connect online and I'd say, how's everybody? You guys fine? And everybody, for the most part, had their cameras on and they would just put up a thumbs up or they'd be like, we're fine. And somehow it wasn't resonating with me. I was like, no, they're not fine. But I knew that nobody was going to sit on the camera and complain in front of their classmates. And so I spent a lot of time reaching out to my students. And once I did that, the truth came out. They weren't happy. They weren't, they were miserable. And so 2020 for me was all about being innovative, thinking about ways that I could support my students and I could find ways to help them thrive. To me, Black history is multi-layered. Black history for me is about sort of learning about the past, but also learning about how the past can influence or also help us to strategize about the future. So often I think that when we think about history, we think about facts and figures, and we think about, sort of spouting off certain occasions. But for me, it's more about, history is people. It's people and events, and it's putting those things together. And so when I think about Black history, I'm always thinking about what are the things and the people and the events that have come before me that are influencing maybe even now the way that I think, but also how can I use the lessons of the past and even the present to help us to be successful in the future. As I'm getting older, I'm also thinking more and more not just about the United States, of course, but I'm thinking more about Black diasporic history, how sort of global spaces work together, and how, in fact, those global spaces are going to have a real influence over what future spaces are going to look like.